So this is Genesis chapter 16. This is the New Revised Standard Version. I'm just going to read the passage. I think I'll do the whole chapter here, Lucas, and then we'll go back through. It says, now Sarai, Abram's wife, bore him no children. She had an Egyptian slave girl whose name was, so we usually say Hagar. The person who's helping me pronounce Hebrew has reminded me it should be pronounced Hagar. So for what it's worth. And Sarai said to Abram, you see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my slave girl. It may be that I should obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her slave girl, and gave her to her husband Abram as a wife. He went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, may the wrong done to me be on you. I gave you my slave girl for your embrace. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarai, your slave girl is in your power. Do to her as you please. Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she ran away from her. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave girl of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, now you have conceived and shall bear a son. You shall call him Ishmael, for the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He shall be a wild ass of a man, with his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he shall live at odds with all his kin. So she named the Lord who spoke to her. You are El Roi. For she said, have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him? Therefore the well was called Be'er Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. That's quite a little story, isn't it?
Yeah.
So as we go back to the beginning, I'll ask you a question. This is kind of a pop quiz. I didn't prepare you for it, Lucas.
Oh boy.
But I thought it'd be fun. Is there any significance, and obviously there is, or I wouldn't be asking, to the fact that Hagar is Egyptian? How does that connect with what's come previously? Is that pointed enough?
Well, yeah, Abram allowed Sarai to go with Pharaoh because she told her it was his sister.
Yeah, so this looks like the most likely narrative conclusion is that she picked up this maidservant as a consequence of all that boondoggle that occurred in Egypt. So remember, they leave with some wealth. Pharaoh gives them some gifts as they leave after Abram lied, like you said, about Sarai he said she was his sister. Pharaoh takes her into his house. Unspecified plagues occur. Pharaoh realizes Sarai is the problem. He confronts Abram. Abram confirms his fears. They send him out and they give him things. Well, it looks to me like Hagar joins the caravan of Abram through those events. It's harder to explain how they would have had an Egyptian servant that would have been with them from Ur. So just a little historical tidbit that this woman is not in an ideal position.
Certainly not.
Yeah, I mean, we knew that from the story, but probably she may have been forcibly sent from her homeland.
Yeah, probably. It seems like a lot of the maids would have came from a family that wouldn't have been able to give like some sort of endowment.
Yeah.
So they wouldn't be able to offer Hagar up to another man to be like the main wife. So in this case, possibly she can end up as the maid.
Yeah.
But
These
either way,
servants, it's probably important to say, like, because we're always, whenever we hear the word slavery, we're always thinking about the kind of slavery that occurred in the Americas and in Europe in more recent history. And slavery has existed in every culture throughout history. So it's not surprising that you'd find slaves in just about every ancient text, because they always exist. But not all slavery is the same. And we've already discussed, Minister Joe and I talked about this when we talked about Eliezer, who is Abram's slave technically, but also the heir to his estate. So slavery isn't quite the, it's an institution we're well to be passed. And I think the gospel begins to sow the seeds of its final destruction right in the teachings of Jesus. But this is a different kind of slavery. It's not the chattel slavery that was, can you believe? I mean, I'll just say this, Lucas, we'll leave it at this. I cannot believe that a culture that had walked with the gospel for as long as it had ended up perpetrating the worst version of slavery in recorded history. It's astounding to me. But in any case, the slavery that Hagar is a part of is probably not like that. It's probably not generational. It probably only lasts for a period of time, or maybe in the worst case, the life of this person. But her children wouldn't have been slaves. Ishmael, and it's clear enough in the promise made to Ishmael, he's not going to be Abram's slave. But that's probably not miraculous, because this is not the slavery of which we are most familiar.
Right.
So I'll say all that. Sorry. Just want to make sure that we're being historically sensitive. Not that it's good. She's in a terrible position. But
right. But yeah, it's good to note that it's not quite the same.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about the dilemma that Sarai finds herself in. She's aware of Abram's original call, that they're going to become a great nation. She's aware that they don't have an heir. And what do you think has precipitated her concern about that now? Because they're quite old.
Yeah, I think in part, I mean, they make note that it's been 10 years, so I think she's just becoming impatient.
Yeah.
It's like, and maybe she thought that they had done something wrong, and up until this point, maybe they hadn't done enough. And there was like, well, if there's a solution, maybe we could help it along.
Yeah, we were talking about this before we started recording, and I want to flesh it out a little bit more, because there's something here about the way Abram and Sarai understand promises God makes. Because you could take that very passively, right? God makes a promise, so, well, he'll do it when he wants to do it. Like, we don't have to worry about it. But that's clearly not their thought process, right? I mean, God's made a promise. We still aren't sure. You and I discussed this. We're not sure if Sarai knows about the specific promise made in chapter 15, that Abram would have a child by his own body. We don't know if she knows that. It's not clear if she does. But she might know it, because she does try to figure out a way for Abram to have a child. So maybe it's the promises of God that's creating the sense of urgency, but they seem clearly to feel it's partially in their hands to make sure that this promise is fulfilled. You and I were talking about that a little bit before, but let's do it live. Like, how do you feel about that? Like, generally, are we responsible to participate in the bringing forth of God's promises, or should we be passive and just let them happen?
I think we're very responsible for God's promises being followed through on. I think different maybe people in areas there makes it easier, and maybe God will wait for the right group to fulfill it completely.
Yeah.
But
so you don't see like the impulse to figure out how they can better assist God. You don't think that's a bad impulse from the beginning?
No, I think when God makes a promise, we should be like searching and listening and seeing what we can do.
Yeah.
And like when is this going to happen? How is this going to work? What's going on here? I mean, in this case, it's about having an heir, a son.
Yeah, I think it depends on the promise, obviously. I mean, sometimes God could make a promise you couldn't possibly do anything about. But the promise that you're going to have children always implies that you're going to be involved in this process somehow. So I agree with you. I think depending on the promise, a great many of the promises God has made will require our involvement, willing involvement, right?
Right.
So I think I agree with you. Now, this is a different culture. We would never, right, seek to do it this way, because this would be adultery. This would be marrying a second wife. These are all things that by the time we hit the new covenant of Jesus and the teachings of the New Testament, many of these options are taken off the table. But to be fair to them, in their culture, there was nothing morally wrong about this according to the cultural standards. And God hasn't told them anything that would make this wrong, at least not at this point. So marrying a servant and having that person become a concubine is something that routinely happens throughout the narratives of Genesis and even extends itself into the Kings. So this is culturally an option.
Right. This is a common thing, really.
Yeah, quite. That doesn't make it right. I want to be clear, but it is common. So what we have here is Sarah being creative in trying to help along a promise that God has made. And she feels after 10 years, she's already gotten the answer on whether she would be the mother. That's a long time to wait.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, have you thought about that before?
Anyways, like they're already fairly old at this point. It'd have been one thing if they were in their 20s and they had to wait 10 years. But anyways.
Yeah, to share a personal story, after I had my cancer, I was telling you this before we started recording, we faced infertility because cancer treatments, especially the type I had with the chemo I had, generally make a person infertile. I mean, the percentage rates are really, really high. And so we did some fertility treatments in advance just to make sure that we would have a chance to have children. But I remember after my chemo, I wanted to wait like 5 years because I wanted to be sure I wasn't going to have the cancer wasn't going to recur. I thought that'd be a terrible way to bring children into the world. You know, they're a year old and I'm going through cancer treatment and then I die. You know, so I was very worried about all that. But once we reached a certain point and I felt like we could, and then we tried. Like, it's a very embarrassing process. Anyone who's been through fertility treatments, I think would share this experience, that it's a humiliating process every step of the way. The things you have to talk about, the things you have to do, the way things have to be done. It's just all horrible. Like, you wouldn't wish it on anybody. And we went for several months, 4 months, I think, the emotional rigmarole, the physical rigmarole, the going into the doctors, paying lots of money, like all the stuff. And after 4 months, nothing happened. And I was like, I'm done. I'm absolutely done. I can't do this month after month anymore. But I said to Jen, but it's up to you. If you want to keep doing it, but you don't have to do it for me. I'm done. And she wanted to go further. So we did. And we had Gabriel. It's a good thing. I mean, I was clearly an idiot. But that was 4 months I was that discouraged. Can you imagine having the promise that you're going to have children and heirs for 10 years and never seeing anything? I mean, I couldn't even last more than 4 months. So I want to say that as it's easy to talk about this instance with Sarah as a huge lack of faith, but I want to at least give her props. 10 years before they made this choice. It's a long time.
No. I mean, 10 years without really seeming to have any answer to the promise. I mean, it's a long time for anybody to wait between like significant events.
Yeah.
And
I talked about this with Minister Joe. I mean, I don't know if you feel this way, Lucas, but I feel like this Abraham story is full of these gaps. And I think the Bible is full of them, between when God makes a promise and when he fulfills it. And that what's critical is the life lived in between those two things. And we see it played out again here.
Right. I mean, God gives usually what happens is God gives a promise and then the people somehow fall astray somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
Because it's been too long. they think. And
Right.
then, like you're saying, eventually, maybe after multiple occasions of people falling down, the
Yeah.
promise is eventually fulfilled.
So
And
we're
some
both
promises are over so long, or 400 years.
right. Oh yeah, that's even longer, right? I mean,
So you got to wait generations of people that didn't even know the original person.
oh, so
But now,
many generations. Can you imagine 400 years? So we're both in agreement that the impulse to maybe help this promise along is not necessarily judged. And the method they use culturally is within cultural norms. And yet it's wrong. This is not how God intended to bring this about. How could they have had better discernment? Like, what would you expect if you were to advise or learn something from this? What would you do different?
yeah, that's a great question, really. I mean, I was thinking about that reading this passage. Like, how do you, like, if you're Abram or Sarai, how do you even know that
Yeah.
this isn't what God wanted?
And now, most people, when I ask questions like that, they'll say something like, well, they should have prayed. And I feel the same way. But we have to remember when they lived. They've not received the law of Moses. No promise has been made to them that anytime they want to talk to God, he'll be available to them. At each case, he's already had the experience that he made altars and called on the name of the Lord, but God didn't speak to him at all those occasions. God seems to be choosing when he comes to Abram. So there is a general sense that Abram, if God doesn't take the initiative to start a conversation with him, we don't see anywhere in the Abraham story to this point that Abram initiates a conversation and God responds. So they're in a very difficult situation. They have a promise. They've had some intense experiences with God, and yet they have no way to inquire further.
So I suppose it's possible that this was kind of their only option to try, and God wasn't necessarily super upset that they tried this, even though it was wrong.
Yeah.
But with such a limited amount of material to work off of, Abram's got to have some trial and error, and like, what does this God, who Abram really doesn't even know that well, like, what does he expect from it? Is this
Right.
maybe this is something that would be reasonable to expect? Because, like we're saying, this is a culturally normal thing.
Yeah.
It seems like this could work, and initially it kind of does work.
And on paper, it fulfills all the stipulations of the promise. Child after Abraham himself, it's going to be one of his own seed. So why not? I want to suggest that we are in this space more than we often think. If we really think about it, we find ourselves many times in the situation where we have a general idea of what God wants. And we have a cultural idea of how those things are best done. And then we have to negotiate. And one of the things I've often said is, when God is not speaking, culture speaks for God. I don't find that many people agreeing with me when I say that, but I seem to keep insisting it. When God is not speaking, culture speaks for God. And when culture takes over a Christian's life, I think it's generally a sign that God is not speaking, or at least they're not cognizant of God speaking. They're not hearing him speak. And I think that's what's happened here. This is a very cultural way of fulfilling a very unlikely promise. How else would an 87-year-old man, or however old Abraham is at this, I think 87, how else is an 87-year-old man who's married to a woman very near his age, who's been barren her whole life, how else is he going to have a kid?
Right.
This is a cultural solution. We have to be very careful about this, because I see this replayed. Like King Saul, I mentioned this in our conversation last week. King Saul is watching all the children of Israel abandon him on the eve of battle because Samuel is taking too long to get there and make the sacrifice. And so Saul makes a sacrifice. I often say this to people: there's nothing wrong with a king making a fellowship sacrifice. Samuel is not a priest. He's a judge. He's from the tribe of Ephraim. He's not a priest. So there's nothing priestly about the sacrifice. It's just about obedience. And David makes sacrifices on his own. There's no problem with Saul doing it. These are all culturally acceptable. The problem is God told him not to do it. He told him to wait. That's what makes it wrong. But Saul panics because it's taking too long. And he sees negative consequences for the waiting too long. I think the same thing is here. Sarah's feeling, we got to raise a child here. I'm not getting any younger. It's been 10 years. I was old the day he made the promise. And so when we start to panic or feel pressure, to be very careful, because in those seasons, culture tends to speak way louder than God. And that's a principle that I draw out of this. And I think they fall prey to this because I think mostly of fear. But I could be wrong. You have thoughts on that? How do you respond to that?
Well, when you went through Hebrews and we looked at like the faith of Abram, and I think one of the things that stood out to me most was that like Abram is learning about what things he should be trying to do, what ways he could have better followed God. And that story is played out here. And sometimes we see things where he shouldn't have done this. He could have done this better. So this is a case where the story is shared with us of a time where they were trying to do something that seemed reasonable, but they were wrong. But God didn't hold it against them too greatly. I mean,
Ishmael gets blessed. I mean, there's conflict. Let's move into this because we want to make sure we keep moving through. So talk to me. You had some opinions about the way Sarah or Sarai at this point treats Hagar. And I've been pronouncing it Hagar because her name means the foreigner. Gar means stranger, foreigner, resident, alien, that kind of thing. And Ha means the. So Hagar means the foreigner. That's her name, the foreigner. Very nice. She's Egyptian, so that's why I'm pronouncing it that way. But we talked a little bit about how this was Sarah's idea. Abram follows through. Hagar becomes pregnant. Sarah responds. Talk to me about that response.
Yeah, so immediately Hagar, I'll try to remember to say it.
Yeah, it's fine if it's Hagar. Hagar is how we say it, but yeah, Hagar is the Hebrew, yeah.
She looks like contempt with Sarai. Because in this culture, not everything, but being pregnant and bearing children is one of the most important things for a woman to do. It's like a pride thing. It's an honor thing. So the fact that Sarai can't do that and she's old and hasn't been able to her whole life, like she's low on the totem pole, and Hagar rises up here and immediately she conceives a kid with Abram. So it's kind of natural that Hagar would feel kind of better about themselves and doesn't feel as much the slave maid kind of character that she originally was, like we suggested maybe from when they were with Pharaoh in Egypt. Yeah.
And something's been put to rest for Sarai that maybe we assume was always put to rest because we're very used to kind of the Western European idea that barrenness is always the fault of the woman. And never the fault of the man. And that was assumed in Europe for a long period of time. And we often read that back and assume that the ancient Near East probably had the same assumptions, that if barrenness was always the fault of the woman. And I think there is a disproportionate amount of blame on the woman. You can see it in some of the stories from this period that women were. But, Sarai might have carried in her heart the idea that this was a problem they both had, or maybe even Abram was the problem. And the moment he's with Hagar, she gets pregnant. So now we know who the problem is.
But
that's probably not a pleasant realization either.
Right. She's probably embarrassed, and maybe, like you're saying, she had hoped that it was kind of a mutual issue, which would be understandable. Abram being 87.
Yeah.
So, and Hagar was almost 9 or 10 years younger, so she'd have been 77, something like that.
I don't know how old Hagar is. She could have been really young.
No, not Hagar. I meant Sarai.
Sarai, yeah. I think, something like that, younger. Yeah, so there's a lot complicated here. And of course, I don't know. It's clear that Sarai interprets Hagar's behavior as contemptuous. But that's how Sarai sees it. It may or may not be true. I don't know. How do you read it? Do you think Hagar's in the wrong?
I mean, it says that when she looked on contempt with her mistress.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I would say, yeah.
Yeah, you think it is?
Hagar definitely had a role to play.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it was made worse by the way that Sarai already felt about things, and that's why
Yeah.
she ends up acting so harshly. Which I think what we're trying to get at here is the way that Sarai treated Hagar.
Yeah. And then what do you think about, because we'll get to how Sarai ends up treating her, but what do you make of Abram's response to this? When Sarai tells him, this is why I was focusing on maybe it was Sarai's perspective, because in verse 5, she's the one who informs Abram that Hagar is looking on her with contempt.
Right. Which tries to almost blame Abram, like, may the Lord judge between you and me. Like Abram somehow caused this debacle that they have now.
Yeah.
Even though Sarai like brought it up, and Abram is definitely in part to blame because he just went along with it.
Do you think it indicates that Sarai had hoped Abram would say no?
I never thought of that. I don't think that's the case. The way I read it, Sarai seems like intent on solving a problem they had.
Yeah.
I mean, for like the man who's looking for the heir in this time, like Abram is obviously the one that's going to be most wanting to have an heir.
Yeah.
But Sarai probably also has a similar urgency, and she knows that she's the one that would have to bear the child, generally speaking, unless you try to do it through this way.
Yeah.
So I'm sure she's concerned. I mean, everyone, I guess, wants to have somebody to take care of all their things.
Yeah, I just get this sense. I mean, the book of Hebrews praises Sarai, as one who submitted herself to her husband. But part of me thinks that Hebrews praises her because she is mistreated. I mean, when she goes into Egypt and then later with Abimelech, he lies about her to protect himself, and she gets taken into these houses. Who knows what she experiences while she's there. And then here she suggests to him, maybe you should take my maidservant and that you can produce an heir. And he seems to jump at it without question. And the woman gets pregnant right away. And now, I mean, maybe it's just because I've been married for a while, but I suspect that Sarai's suggestions are at the same time tests. I'm not saying Jen does that to me, but every time you make a suggestion to someone that you love, you always have an anticipated best case response. And a lot of the time, you don't get it. And that creates even more resentment. I think there's a lot of dynamics going on here with Sarai and Abram. And I think Sarai, the way things work out are not exactly the way Sarai imagined it when she proposed it to Abram. Now, I'm reading that through my own filter of experience with relationships and with counseling folks in relationships. But I have a feeling, I'm trying to understand why Sarai is so judgmental of Abram. And I think it's because this suggestion was not what it appeared. Otherwise, I don't see why she's angry with him. I don't see why this is his fault.
Yeah, that's definitely, I mean, I hadn't thought of that. And the way that you laid out, it definitely is a possibility. What first occurred to me was more so that, like, Sarai had this idea that is reasonable, but when she sees how it ended up with Hagar, and now Hagar is like acting like she's better than Sarai, it kind of just blames Abram because she's upset maybe with herself, and she's taking it out on Abram because now they have this problem, and he just doesn't know how to handle it.
A very similar thing happens with Jacob and his two wives. He marries Leah and Rachel. He loves Rachel more. And Leah is vindicated because she's bearing children. And then she goes through a period of time where she's not bearing any more children. It really concerns her. So she begs Jacob to take her maidservant as his wife so that the maidservant can produce children for her. Jacob just kind of goes along with this, but it causes such division in the family. I just have a feeling that this did not work out as Sarai imagined it would. Hagar is actually not a thing. She's a person, and she's proud of what has happened, and Sarai doesn't appreciate it. And so all of this culminates in verse 6, when Abram says, hey, do with her what you want. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, I mean, Abram is very passive in this passage.
But he still treats Hagar like she's Sarah's or Sarai's slave.
Right.
But Sarai gave her to him as a wife, as a concubine. Why doesn't he protect her?
I mean, it could be that he just cares more for Sarai, and maybe he knew that in Abram's mind this was just a way for Sarai to have a child. I mean, it's interesting that he took him as a wife, because he didn't really have to do that.
Yeah, and again, I think that's a little bit of a translation thing, because the word is just Isha, as a woman, but that often does mean wife. I'm guessing it's more like a concubine.
Yeah, I mean, if it was more like a concubine, then I would assume that Abram is married to Sarai. That was first, so that and Sarai is the one that's like almost attacking Abram, like,
yeah,
bringing this up. So he just says like, this was your whole idea. This is your maid.
Yeah,
like whatever you think is best.
Yeah, and then Sarai takes this as license. Abram says you can do to her as you please, and she deals with her terribly. Now, you did a little research on this phrase and where it comes up again. Where else does this kind of treatment show itself?
Yeah, so the way that Sarai is dealing with Hagar is the same terms used for the way Israel was treated by the Egyptians when they were enslaved. So the way that it's described, and the way that they would end up crying out to God. Yeah. So they were treated. Hagar was treated in the same way that the Israelite slaves were treated. So pretty terribly.
And it's not a good verb. Like in Hebrew, it's a PL. And you don't know anything about Hebrew, so you just have to take my word for this. But that's a verbal stem that means intensive action, meaning that it's done repeated, iteratively, as we say, over and over again. So this is not a single, my point is, it's not a single act of harshness, but it's an ongoing, like, intensive kind of persecution. So this is not pleasant for Hagar. This is not making Sarai or Abram look like good people to me. Like, this whole thing has gotten out of hand. So Hagar runs away. Now that's where the story takes an interesting turn. Because the angel of the Lord, who to this point has only appeared to Abram, maybe Melchizedek, right? We don't know that. Obviously, he's had interactions with God, but it's not narrated. But he appears to Hagar and makes a promise to her about her son. You and I talked about this in advance. Not the greatest promise ever made, but not bad. So talk about your response to this promise. So the angel interrogates her, where are you going? She says, I'm running away from my mistress. Angel of the Lord says, go back, return to her. We could spend all day, Lucas, talking about that command of God. Right? I mean, it resonates with 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and Paul's advice to people who are married to unbelievers. It strikes passages like slaves be obedient to your masters and things like that. We see in the household codes in Colossians and in 1 Peter. So we could spend all day on that. But with that aside for a moment, the angel of the Lord makes a promise to her. So go back, but I'm going to make a promise. Ishmael is going to become a great nation. He's going to multiply. And he's going to make him an independent, adversarial nation, right? He's going to live on his own. He's going to be at odds with other people. He's not going to make treaties and things like that. So you and I were talking about this. I mean, is this an appealing promise made to her?
No, when I read 12 originally, and still when I read 12, I'm trying to see how Hagar reacts well to this promise. I mean, he'll be a wild ass of a man with his hand against everyone. everyone is going to be against him. He will live at odds with all of his kid and like his family. That's, to me, that sounds like a bunch three terrible things that are going to happen. But like you say, he's going to be independent, and I suppose, and maybe at this point, Hagar was worried about the future of her son at all because she was cast out essentially by her family.
So I didn't mention this when we were first talking because I still can't recover just off my memory the exact verse. I'm pretty sure it's in God's response to Job at the end of that book, if I'm remembering it correctly. But God, I'm pretty sure it's there, so that's where I'm going to assume it. Anybody can double check it and see if I'm right about that. But when God is explaining who he is, and I'm pretty sure it's to Job, and he's kind of saying to Job, who do you think you are? He says, who let the wild donkey go free? Who broke his bonds and set him free from his masters? That is this idea that donkeys are domesticated generally. That's how everybody meets a donkey. They're a domesticated animal, a beast of burden, but some of them are wild in this part of the world. And they're wild because they broke free. Now, I often thought the donkey must have been wild first, and then they must have domesticated it. But I'm guessing maybe these donkeys don't come from this region. That maybe they came in as domesticated animals and then they populated it through being broken free. The way that horses in the Americas, there were no wild horses in America. They originated, we think in Asia. But some of the settlers who brought horses, their horses got free, and now we have wild horses in America. It seems that everything I read in the Old Testament is that that's true of the donkey, that it must have been domesticated someplace else. But by the time of even Hagar, there were wild donkeys. And the way the First Testament uses the language is that God sets this donkey free, that they were once slaves. And somehow it's a symbol in the Old Testament, at least in these two texts, of being free from slavery. And I'm guessing that that's how she's reading this promise, that she's a slave, but he won't be anyone's slave. And I have a sense that's the only positiveness of this. But that's a guess, Lucas. That's why I want to say it authoritatively, but that's the way I see this happening, that she at least is hearing, your son is going to be his own nation. He's not going to be in the tents of Abram. He's not going to be a slave of Sarah or of anybody. In fact, he's going to be at odds with everybody. He's not going to let anybody rule him. And I think for a person who is in Hagar's situation, that's a great hope, that her offspring will not have to endure what she's enduring.
Right. I mean, as you're talking about it, like from the position of a slave, someone who like can't talk back to the person who owns them, makes all the decisions for them. They're submissive in every way.
She had to marry Abram. She had a choice.
Everything that in her life is already decided by other people. So the idea that you can make your own decisions, even if it's something that causes conflict. I mean, we think like, oh, you wouldn't want to be in conflict with other people, but that's because maybe we choose to have conflict with people,
right?
Not because we're not allowed to have conflict with other people, or we get like beaten or whipped or cast out. We don't get to eat, have nowhere to live. Yeah. So in that way, that's what I've been reading. That it was like an independence kind of thing. There was freedom involved, but at first, so when you read it, it doesn't sound great.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like the kind of blessing
you got to pick out like the things that seem like they're a blessing.
But what's interesting is she leaves because she's being oppressed. That's why. This is what God says to her. And then she calls him El Roy. And she indicates that this God, not only has she seen God, but he sees her. Like somehow in the promise he makes, he understands her. This is a promise that only perhaps a slave would understand. But he understands her and makes a promise that speaks exactly to her distress. And it's based on this promise that he sends her back. It's not submit for the sake of submission, right? It's not go and be persecuted because it's good for you or because this is just the order of things. But go back, I'm going to set your son free. So it's just interesting that God sends her back into a difficult situation, but now with a reason.
Right.
And she endures it. She endures it. I mean, I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, the El Roy, like the God who sees. So, like, God had seen what she had went through, and then finds her at this well or spring. And like you said, and kind of like I was saying, like a slave would think this is a blessing.
Yeah.
Because maybe this is exactly how she was feeling. Like this is maybe exactly what she was hoping to have maybe for herself. And maybe it's just not what she's going to have for herself, but this is what her son could have.
Yeah. I think that's part of it. And then Abram names the child Yishmael in Hebrew, which means God will hear. It's from Shema, but it's an imperfect of Shema. He will hear, or he is hearing. So there is a sense in which Ishmael, I would imagine that this name means something different for Abram than it does for Hagar. Because for Hagar, it clearly reflects this experience of God making this promise to her. For Abram, though, I wonder why he names the child this. Is it just based solely on Hagar's experience? Or is there some hope in Abram that God is going to hear? That in having this child, God will hear Abram's desperation, will see Abram's sincerity? Is the birth of Ishmael a prayer from Abram to God? I'm wondering, it's just very interesting, it's Abram who names him this. If Hagar named him Ishmael, I understand it completely.
Right.
But it's Abram who names him this. God will hear, or God is hearing, God is listening.
I mean, from this passage, Hagar is one that seems like they need to hear most from God because she's the one being oppressed. She's the one who got cast out, and everything is just like falling down on Hagar. But at the same time, I mean, Sarai and Abram were the ones that initiated this because they hadn't been hearing from God.
Right.
They didn't know what they should do, and they ended up obviously being in the wrong in the way they treat Hagar.
Yeah.
But in the
And
end,
this was not the way that God intended the promise he made in chapter 12 to be fulfilled. It was not, in that sense, not God's will, but God does use it.
so for both Hagar, who had understood that God heard her cries and heard her desperation, in the same way Abram, like, is maybe hoping and understands like God hears, as maybe Hagar shared this story with Abram. I mean, in some ways, they must have like figured out why Hagar came back. I mean, I mean, you know how you treat people, and when you treat someone as terribly as they did, I'm sure they weren't surprised that she ran away. And maybe that was their intention or Sarai's intention. Abram just complicit.
Yeah.
But
and if she had succeeded in running away, Abram would have lost his only living heir. So I'm sure he received her coming back as it was a welcome.
Right.
You know. So yeah, it's such an interesting story, right? I mean, it's hard sometimes to read these stories about people that we consider to be very godly people. You know, in some ways they're presented to us as pinnacles of faith. I mean, Abram was just called righteous in chapter 15, and because of his faith in God, and yet, you know, making decisions that you just cannot morally justify, especially from our vantage point. But even in their day, even though, you know, Hagar being a slave, that's cultural. Maybe Sarai having the authority to hand her maidservant over as a concubine to Abram, that also might have been cultural. So we could judge the culture, but we can't really judge the individuals because they're living within their culture. But the way they treat her is clearly, even the way the scriptures depict it, it's not morally right. And Abram's refusing to protect Hagar in any way from this treatment, clearly not. Good. So, you know, it's hard to read our patriarchs with this kind of a lens where we realize that they're not perfect people and they're not treating other people well, and yet they're still following God. I think this is a story about the road we take in following God to become more godly over time, and not about painting a pristine example of someone who made no mistakes.
Right. It's easy, I think. And like the way I grew up and the way I for a long time read the scriptures is like, if we're reading a passage, like this is like the way people were supposed to do things. Like somehow
Right.
Abram and Sarai were right in what they did here. And like Hagar must have always been in the wrong.
Yeah.
And like you said, like this is a story of people following God, Abram being righteous and everything. But I mean, I would say that Abram wasn't righteous in this case. He's trying, he is maybe generally following God, but in this instance, a significant story, obviously, because it made it into the Bible out of the 10-year span here. And then later on is a time where we get to see where Abram wasn't faithful.
Yeah. And we get a
But he was
picture
called
of,
faithful. So we're prepared by the scriptures, like, oh, Abram's faithful guy. And now we have this. And immediately, I mean, not immediately because it's been 10 years, but immediately in the text. So it doesn't maybe feel as long usually when we read it.
yeah.
And then you have something like this where they're like contemplating. It's not like even a random kind of thing. Like they talked about this happening over a period of time. And like you said, with like that verb there, with the PL or however it goes.
Yeah, PL,
like they were
you got it.
they were continuously doing something.
Yeah, it was intensive.
It wasn't like just one day they treated Hagar like trash.
Yeah. It was repetitive behavior that's happening over and over. Yeah, it's, I don't want to justify. I don't want to say like, well, see how patient God is with us, so don't worry about your sin. Like, I don't want to go there. And I know you're not going there. I don't want people to go there because I don't think that's what this is about. But I think we have to recognize that most of the values that we're seeing played out in the life of Abram are cultural values. And it takes time for God to work out those cultural values and give Abram a different way of living. And he doesn't do it all at once. He doesn't drain the swamp in a week. You know what I mean? He draws this poison, this toxin out of Abram slowly. And it's not really till much later that the Abram that's celebrated in Hebrews really materializes in the flesh. He's there in principle in chapter 15. I mean, Abram has the kind of trust in God, but Abram doesn't even know what he doesn't know yet. Yeah. And so we see them taking cultural cues. And what else can we do? We're the same. Like you and me, when we make a decision, culture screams loud, and we do what our culture tells us is right. But God will, in time, confront those cultural values and begin to call us out of them. And the real test of faith is how we respond to that. But so long as our primary formation is cultural and not scriptural, we like to think, American culture is biblical culture, but we know it's not, right? Maybe there might have been a time in the past where they were much more closely aligned, but not anymore anyway. So we also have to recognize in the story of Abram that doing what's right in your culture is not always the same as doing what's right. And that's a lesson that Abram is going to learn. But he hasn't learned it yet.
Right.
Yeah. So, do you have any, the only thing I said I would mention, and I'll just throw this out, is that Paul in the book of Galatians uses this experience between Sarah and Hagar as a metaphor for the relationship between Israel and the church. And it's a very perplexing metaphor, the way he uses it in Galatians. I still have a very hard time figuring out exactly what his point is. But essentially, he argues that Israel is in the place of Hagar and the church is in the place of Sarai. And that Israel gives birth to Ishmael and it's the church that gives birth to Isaac. It's a very perplexing metaphor. It's a reason I've never preached through Galatians. I've preached from Galatians, but I've never preached through it because I still don't understand the metaphor. But I should at least admit that we know that this comes up in the New Testament. But boy, it doesn't help. Paul's use of this story does not help us understand this story in this context. But anyway, if anybody, I've had people, I always confess that I struggle with this metaphor. I took the book of Galatians in Greek from a wonderful, wonderful professor at Nazarene Theological Seminary. It was a full semester course on that one book, which is a very short book. We translated the whole thing from Greek. Each of us was assigned a different commentary. We came to class discussions. We had to present what our commentary added to the conversation. So it was a very well-orbed class, very well designed. I couldn't make heads or tails of that metaphor. And when my teacher tried to explain it, and either he didn't understand it or I couldn't understand him. It just perplexed me. So I've had people offer suggestions to me. Whenever I say that, I have people say, well, I can tell you what that means. And then they tell me. Nobody's persuaded me that they've got it yet. So anyway, I mentioned at the beginning that I would mention my white whale is understanding how this story is being used by Paul in the book of Galatians. I don't want Jesus to come back till I understand it, but I know that's sacrilegious, and of course he can come back anytime he wants to, but you know what I mean? It's like one of those puzzles I want to solve. Our conversation today hasn't helped me, Lucas. It's helped me understand this story in its context, but I still don't know what to do with Galatians. That'll have to be another discussion.
Well, one time while you were preaching, you had mentioned that there was a place in Galatians that you didn't quite understand, and for that reason, you wouldn't preach through it. So I'm sure people that remember that will be interested to take a look at that passage specifically.
Yeah, this is it. And I did have somebody say to me, you don't have to understand everything to preach through it. And I thought, well, you're not a preacher. You know how hard it is to preach a passage when you don't know where it's going? When you don't know how it arrives at where you get? Very, very difficult, especially Paul. You try and understand their argument before you start preaching it in pieces. And if you can't understand the argument, it's very hard to preach it. So anyway, that's my white whale. If anybody can help, one day we'll get a comment, Lucas. One day.
Yeah, well, maybe later on we could do a video on that passage.
On Galatians. Maybe you'll be the one who saves me from my
well, no,
metaphor.
Not necessarily, but I definitely will take a look at it because I'm interested.
Yeah, it's interesting.
As you're talking about it, that definitely sounds complex. I wouldn't just throw out my immediate, obviously I know the answer because that's so easy. I wouldn't do that to you.
Hey, I've often said, I'm sometimes accused of being highly intellectual. I'm really not. I read these stories so superficially that I think it confuses people. I'd like to read right off the top. You know what I mean? Just right off the surface. These are just very obvious questions, I think, most of the time. But Paul is always a struggle for me because he makes you go way below the surface, way below the surface.
That's why I was a little confused earlier on. You asked me if Hagar initiated the contempt at all. I had to look at it again. I'd read it several times. I was knowing the way that you read this, and it clearly says that. I was let me look at this again to make sure it actually says that.
Yeah, I was asking a deeper question, maybe that's really too superficial for anyone with any intelligence to understand. I was asking who the narrator is.
Right. That had come across my mind, but
because we always assume, right, the narrator is God.
Right. So yeah,
but the narrator, according to tradition, is Moses. And where did Moses think the idea of Hagar looking on Sarah, where did he get the idea? Maybe it was from Sarai's testimony. Maybe. So is it Sarai's perspective that's there, or is the narrator of Genesis an omniscient God? Who's the narrator? That was it's a very superficial question. It's like a English 101, right? In junior high, that's the first thing you get asked. All right, you have to plot, setting, characters, narrator. Who's the narrator? But the reason we don't think about it in Genesis is we just assume the narrator.
Right. We assume, but at the same time, we don't, in this story, we don't know exactly what the idea is. So it's possible that someone had just, either from Sarai, they assumed, this is how Sarai interpreted what happened, so this is what happened.
Yeah, it could be. Or the narrator saying, Sarai experienced it this way, and she's right. Like it absolutely happened, but it was a very superficial question. But you did what I would want done all the time. You went right to the text and said, well, the text indicates that she did it. So we can't make inquiries any further than that. And that's why I didn't push it. I'm like, well, you got me there. Everything else is speculation. So, but it's fun. It's fun to me. You'd be amazed at how much depth there is without going below the surface. And like, if you say, well, give me for instance of going below the surface, Galatians, like that's going below the surface. That's like, all right, so this is Sarah, but what does she represent? This is Hagar, but what does she represent? This is Ishmael and Isaac, but what do they represent? That's when you go really beneath the surface. And
well, that's Paul's intention with most of what he writes. I mean, he's got the Old Testament to work off of, so he has all the people to share from and all the stories.
Right. Yeah, and it's fun to do what Paul does, but that's harder. That's more amorphous. It's harder to be objective about it. It seems once you start going below the surface, things become so subjective. You just hope the Spirit's guiding you. I remember reading Augustine's interpretation of the parable of the Good Samaritan, in which he said, Jericho is the earth, Jerusalem is heaven, the pilgrim is on his way from the earth to heaven, and then the brigands and the thieves are actually Satan, and the spiritual forces of evil that are trying to prevent him from reaching heaven. And the Samaritan, he had a different reading for every person. Once you go there, the controls are off. You can
make it say anything.
Yeah, that's how it feels. And that's why I tend to like to stay on the surface, because at least there it's objective. But it's not to say in my own private thinking, I don't go the way of Augustine. Sometimes I do, but I think that's more for a different kind of conversation. So, well, thank you for joining me, Lucas. Do you have any final words on this story? Anything you want to make sure that people walk away with that maybe we haven't covered, or you think maybe needs clarification, or are you good?
I think we're doing pretty good, but one thing that just kept coming back to me, like you had asked me, like, if this was something that Abram and Sarai should have done, having Hagar have a child with Abram, and like, I didn't really have an answer. I still don't really have an answer, but like, for everyone who's watching, I guess, if you just think about like what maybe he could have done better. Like, they'd already waited 10 years, and like we had said, like, they didn't have the law, they didn't have the same like interactions through prayer that we can have, and things like that. And this is what they were left with.
Yeah.
But then we see the disaster that they have, even though it's not even from God, because God fixes it on Hagar's end for them. But like, obviously we wouldn't want to do this to other people or find ourselves in a similar situation. So maybe just think about the ways that we're being impatient with God's promises.
Yeah, I think one thing I'd want to say in that regard is that you can be wrong and not wrong and yet still wrong. Like, they didn't know any better. They had no law or rule or guidance to tell them that this was an inappropriate direction to go. They only had the word of God, and as far as they could tell, this satisfied what the word of God had said to them. So they're not wrong, meaning that they're morally headed in an obviously immoral direction. But it turns out they're wrong. And yet, this error in judgment that's made really in ignorance does shape the entire future of the people of Israel. I mentioned to you that the Midianites come from the descendants of Ishmael, and Moses marries into that family. So they come into the people of Israel through that marriage, and probably there are others. I know Esau marries a Midianite woman as well, who's a child of Ishmael. And so it shapes the future. God uses this decision of Abram. And so then you ask the question, should they have done it? Well, morally, no. In terms of God's promise, nope, this wasn't how God was going to do it. And yet, it has an effect that is positive in many ways, negative in others, but positive in some ways. Very hard. This is life. It is messy. If you and I expect that we're always going to make the right decision, we're fools. If you're going to fail, though, you want to fail the way Abram fails. You want to fail because you have no reason to believe that what you're doing is wrong. And he had no reason to believe this was wrong, but it was. And so sometimes you and I have to be willing to have someone down the line come back and say to us, you know, you sinned. And we want to say, no, I didn't. I had the best of intentions. There was no way I could have known this was wrong. But sometimes you have to be willing to admit that you did wrong completely unaware and still own the sin, even though you couldn't have done anything else. But that's very hard for people. Very hard for people.
Those are the things Jesus died for, the things that we couldn't have avoided.
And I agree. I would agree with that statement. I think he did, but that still doesn't mean that we might not discover later that we did wrong and need to own it, even though we couldn't have reasonably done anything else at the time.
I wasn't saying that it makes it better. That was just throwing that fact in.
Well, it happens to me as a preacher. Like, I have started to fall under conviction, and I've been sharing it some in sermons too. I've fallen under conviction that some of what we've been doing in the church has been wrong to do. But I'm not claiming we knew it was wrong or that we had any idea what right would have been. So it's wrong in a very different way. It's not like moral or obstinate wrongness. It's not like rebellious wrongness. It's not even like reasonable wrongness where we kind of reasoned our way into doing the wrong thing for all unjustifiable reasons. I think it was just the way we did things. And it's the way we had always done things. And so it was the only good we knew to do. I think Israel was in that situation a lot, where this is how they did it. And then they read the law. Like I just finished the book of Ezra. I know the youth did as well. They read the book of the law and they go, like, we've been sinning this whole time. And most of the people didn't know. So sometimes who you are is revealed in how you respond to revelations about your past that you had no way of knowing when you were actually in it. And I think that's what's happening now. I'm just realizing we have set up a lot of idols in the church. I've been talking about that, but I'm not saying we did it deliberately. And I'm not saying that our parents were idol worshipers, but I am saying that some of what they did was idolatry. You know what I mean? And that's, I think, where Abram is. If looking culturally, this is a reasonable, rational decision that would have looked completely consistent to him with God's will. But after the fact, he realizes he was wrong about that. It takes a big man and a big woman to be able to navigate that with humility. And I think we're kind of forced into a similar situation today, looking back going, wow, what did we do? Why did we do that? But if we're not willing to have that conversation, we'll never grow beyond our prior ignorance. So I don't think God is angry with Abram after this. But if he did it again, I think God would be angry.
It's an opportunity for Abram to learn. And like we're talking about, he knows better what he can expect from God. And if he were perfectly faithful at this point, he'd been 10 years, that's nothing.
Yeah.
God still has plenty of time.
Yeah, because you and I talked about this, a little spoiler alert. How long is it going to be?
Another 13 years.
That's 23 years from promise to fulfillment. Most of us wouldn't make it.
That's a long time.
Yeah. I mean, can you imagine if you're a teenager and something you felt the Lord was promising you, you're 17, 18 years old, not going to happen until your 40s? And most people wouldn't last that long. If God doesn't fulfill what he says within a week, we think it wasn't God.
Right. Yeah, it's easy to think that something that we were sure was once God just seems to not be God anymore if it has been long enough.
Yeah.
And maybe that's what their case they were here. Maybe it's like, maybe that wasn't God, or maybe, like we talked about, like taking a passive role or an active role, and what's going to happen. Like maybe it was us, or maybe it wasn't God. Either way, we've got to do something.
maybe I just heard wrong or thought something, or you go through all that doubt when things are not materializing the way that you thought that they would. So the Abraham story is still so contemporary, and I think if we demystify Abram and stop trying to make him into this something he's not, realize his humanness and how difficult these decisions must have been for him, and how much he had to learn in order to really follow God well. I think we will gain more from his example, because by the time he reaches chapter 22, when he does make a decision that honors God fully, he's come a long way. Just a few chapters in the Bible, but it's decades in the real world. Yeah. 23 years. Amazing. He's in his 70s when God says he's going to have a child. That's a miracle enough. But 99? And one part of the story nobody ever talks about is that he gets married afterwards and has more kids after Sarah dies. Amazing. Anyway, well, thank you, Lucas, for joining me. Thanks for those who have tuned in and hung in with us. And we'll see you next week. I think Minister Joe will be back from vacation. And we'll be moving in to chapter 17, which is another covenant. Another covenant, Lucas. But it's the same covenant renewed with some interesting additions. So we'll get into that next week. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Lucas.